behavioral game theory suggests the strong possibility that moral behavior such as altruism, a sense of fairness, cooperation, a willingness to sacrifice or take losses could have originated from and probably evolved with the human trait of association, exactly as Hume conjectured. As an important aside, it should be interesting to note a finding as recently as last year, October, that when chimpanzees play the ultimatum game, they behave exactly as the textbooks predict. That is, proposing patently unfair divisions and invariably accepting them. It is ironically our closest living primate relatives who act like homines economici. At any rate, such findings from the field should prove a comfort to those who seek the possibility of a secular morality, for they suggest that some fundamental moral values inescapably exist because of society. Indeed, morality is what makes human society possible at all. Hence, it is somewhat misguided to ask what would happen to human society if morality suddenly became secular, for the strong possibility is emerging that some common fundamental secular morals were in fact what made human society possible at all. This is evident from the fact that the most diverse societies, which certainly do not share common religious beliefs in even the broadest sense, manifest commonality in many social values. The psychologist Haidt notes that many emotions are useful in enforcing behavior that is beneficial in validating social cooperation. For example, contempt is useful in punishing cheaters. Gratitude is an emotion that's useful in rewarding altruists. And self-conscious guilt is useful in avoiding cheating. In other words, some of these things you grew up with encourage you to be moral. There are different possible hypotheses of why such commonalities exist. It is, of course, possible to maintain that these traits and emotions have all been instilled in various human societies through history and across cultures by a single divine intelligence, with the tenets of one religion, of course, reflecting the acme of moral perfection, towards which all the others are vainly and imperfectly striving. A simpler hypothesis, however, is that such commonalities are simply the product of a common human and social evolution, although exactly by what process this occurred is still being debated. Steven Pinker, he authored a book called The Blank Slate in 2002, contends that these moral traits and judgments are simply hardwired into the human brain as part of the evolution into Homo sapiens and the society that he forms. That is, individuals with such traits simply fare better than others, and they form societies that reproduce those traits genetically. But there are others, for example, Henrik himself, who have put forward a more flexible explanation, where culture and genes co-evolve, with group selection playing a role. How does this work? Individuals who live in groups with cultural strategies that have managed to deal successfully with their environment are then provided with cultural role models that they may emulate. Whereas other groups in the same environment who have not fared as well may become extinct. This is an appeal to Darwin's neglected idea. We all remember The Origin of Species, but Darwin also wrote The Descent of Man. A neglected idea in The Descent of Man, where he pointed to the possibility that group selection might be possible, owing to the presence of individuals with outstanding moral qualities. That's part of the reason that altruism, even though it is bad for the individual, may be good on the whole, because a group with altruists, or let's say a platoon with heroes, is more likely to survive as a group than a platoon where everybody is a shirker. Now, in this view of Henrik et al., the hardwiring of specific pro-social traits is not necessary. They can instead be learned, depending on which strategies and behaviors the group has found useful and has been practicing, and which can then be imitated by the offspring that are brought up in those groups. This part of the story is not yet written. Whatever the details, however, the fact remains that human beings in a fundamental sense cannot help being moral beings as long as they choose to live in society, just as the Enlightenment philosophers speculated. Now I'm going to talk about the inherently limited nature of public secular morality. So, indeed, the problem is not that morality might fail to emerge in a secular context. Rather, the danger to society is that this unavoidable moral sense actually might go into overdrive. So that, in the words of Pinker again, so that we become not merely a moral animal, but a sanctimonious animal. Psychologists have pointed to the possibility that our moral sense and the emotions that support it may become so confounded that they lead to unreasonable moral judgments. For example, the concern for purity and the associated emotion of disgust that may have evolved from a perfectly healthy need to avoid certain toxic or contaminated biological products. We see this, for example, in the Bible's strictures on diet and the proper preparation of food. This, however, can lead easily to identifying what is good with what is clean or what is white, to the point where it justifies discrimination on the basis of the color of one's skin, that's racial discrimination, or occupation, like a caste system, or one's gender, homophobia, or the restriction against women priests. What is worse, because a good deal of this is either genetically programmed or is the product of long learning and socialization, they are associated with strong feelings, so that individuals frequently do not have a chance to rationally examine what may since have become simply a dysfunctional prejudice. The yuck factor is never a valid moral position. Ang pandidiri o pandurual ay hindi sapat na argumento laban sa isang ideya. And yet, there is built in within us that feeling of disgust in about certain things. Here's Pinker again, who writes a good line regarding this. He says, the difference between a defensible moral position and an atavistic gut feeling is that with the former, we can give reasons why our conviction is valid. We can explain why torture and murder and rape are wrong, or why we should oppose discrimination and injustice. On the other hand, no good reasons can be produced to show why homosexuality should be suppressed, or why the races should be segregated. And the good reasons for a moral position are not pulled out of thin air. They always have to do with what makes people better off or worse off. And they are grounded in the logic that we have to treat other people in the way that we demand that they treat us. So, this possibility that a moral sense, even that of an entire community, may go into overdrive is actually an additional argument why secular morality, unlike perhaps morality based on religious belief, which must aim for comprehensiveness, why secular morality ought by its very nature to set limits for itself and be deliberately unambitious in scope. Public secular morality seeks to govern only the res publica, not the res privata, ruling only on actions that pertain to public life. In the language of economics, I suppose you would call them externalities. I tried to point out that, properly speaking, secular morality would do best to restrict its sphere to those affecting public life, since by doing so, it would allow for and affirm the greatest diversity of belief and behavior in the private sphere. At the beginning, I also mentioned that the Enlightenment thinkers were probably induced to conceive, well, this is speculation, maybe they thought of the urgency of secular morality and the separation of state and religion owing to the long and painful history of religious wars in Europe and the subsequent need for people of different creeds to live together in society. But here's the question for the Philippines. What need is there of a secular morality when, as we have here, there is an overwhelming majority of people who profess one faith. Can we not simply accept whatever is the common faith and move beyond the limited scope of secular morality and adopt a deeper commonality, not only in observable actions, but also in unobservable thought and opinion? I contend that a minimal secular morality in the public sphere is even more important in precisely this situation, when a large majority already shares a consensus on moral values. The first reason is a matter of principle, and it was Rosa Luxemburg who put it best. Meinungsfreiheit ist immer die Meinungsfreiheit des Andersdenkenden. To paraphrase, the freedom of thought is real freedom of thought is the freedom of those who think differently. To measure freedom in society, we should not ask how free the devout Catholic lowlander fares, but rather, what is the state of liberty for Muslims, Protestants, Itas, and other indigenous peoples, atheists, agnostics, gays and homosexuals, gamblers and smokers, people who want a divorce, teens who need an abortion, and oh yes, women. And the second point is a pragmatic one that flows from the earlier discussion. From an evolutionary viewpoint, as we have seen, social groups develop moralities through the interaction of culture, genes, and group selection. And these are moralities that are appropriate for a given time and environment. Recall the diversity. There's some commonality, but also a diversity in the kinds of societies that were studied by this group of anthropologists and economists. But those moralities, if you can call them that, are good only for a certain time and environment. A greater homogeneity of the social group, of course, yields benefits in the form of social cohesion, better rules enforcement, and cooperation. On the other hand, especially when the environment is rapidly changing, the stability and homogeneity of beliefs can disable the group from rapidly adapting to its environment and implementing innovative strategies. Precisely because the majority in society is too stable in its values, too pat, too sanctimonious. In such rapidly changing circumstances, some evolutionists tell us there is an especial need for diversity within the group in the shape of what Stephen Jay Gould, the late paleontologist, has termed hopeful monsters. That is, individuals who carry some traits, behaviors, or ideas that deviate significantly from the present norm, but which may prove socially beneficial when the environment and technology change rapidly. In economics, we call these hopeful monsters entrepreneurs. In a good sense. Needless to say, I believe that a university, and particularly this university, is meant to be the source of such hopeful monsters. And it is a question whether we have bred and nurtured enough of them. The last part, I'll go into issues. If our sole purpose in asserting the need for secular morality this afternoon was to indulge in an appreciation of 17th century Enlightenment philosophy, then it would be a pleasant but perhaps still largely idle pastime. The issue of a secular moral viewpoint and universities' role in promoting it, however, happens to be a salient point in many social and economic problems confronting the country.